All right, so we're recording. I'm sorry, we've been covering the vulnerability assessment. So now that we have an understanding of what our sensitivities are from a population perspective, we then look at what the hazards are and the potential likelihood or the dynamics of the hazards. So when we look at hazards, as we've talked about, extreme heat, extreme cold, precipitation, floods, droughts, storms, wildfires, air quality impacts. For each of these, what we do is we identify, what's the current risk hazard? And this is part science and part gut, is it currently high? Is it currently low? What's the expected change? Is it gonna go up in intensity? Is it gonna, or down in intensity? Is it gonna go up in intensity or down in frequency, I'm sorry? And are those changes expected to be kind of a midterm sort of change, a long-term sort of change, or a near-term sort of change? And then wherever there's metrics available, we plug in those metrics, kind of changes over the last 20 years, for instance. And then with that, we can then look at the risks to the population, like health risks to the population. Again, likelihood of occurrence, level of impact, if that does occur, time frame, is it near term, long term, and then overall the risk, which is the likelihood times the impact, if you will. And so as we map that out, the risks that we have the highest risks for tend to be flooding, nutrition insecurity, and then at moderate levels, extreme heat, drought, and vector-borne diseases. We then do the same thing for infrastructure. So things like buildings, roads and transportation, energy, water, agriculture, forestry, environmental biodiversity, etc. And the ones that are highest are land use planning, what that is to say, needing to make sure that our land utilization responds to these impacts, our roads and so forth, and planning out where we put houses and where we put buildings, making sure that we're responsive to flood considerations, those sorts of things. But in addition to that, agriculture, forestry impact potentials, energy, transportation and roads and buildings are higher impact potentials. And then at a moderate level, potentially economic and law enforcement. And then with all of that, we can then map out also what the potential economic impact is for the community by 2100. This comes from a study from Berkeley, by the way, and it's based in 2018 dollars. And the information is at the county level. We then take the county level and prorate it down to Hartford based on population share, which may not be totally accurate, but it's the best data that we have right now. So it gives us a sense that if we don't curb things here societally, by the end of the century, we can anticipate at least $9.9 million worth of economic impact annually in 2018 dollars. So that means by the time we get there, that number will actually be, of course, significantly higher as an actual dollar value, but trying to place it in today dollars. By the way, this figure does not include increased healthcare costs due to increased illness or decrease or increases in property damage due to increased storm or extreme weather events. It's just based on the data that the study covered, which is agricultural impacts, mortality, energy, productivity, property, and violent crime. Part of the reason why we do that is both so we can anticipate what are the impacts, but also provide a mechanism to explore coming up with some sort of a localized social cost of carbon. There's lots of studies about cost of carbon. They range everywhere from, the most common low end is about $50 a ton, a metric ton. They go up to 200 or so a ton. Some go higher than that. The bulk tend to be about between $50 and $150 worth of impact per ton. And so the social cost of carbon is simply saying that for every ton of carbon we emit today, it's going to have an impact on us culturally, societally, at some point in time in the future. So beginning to account for that, because we're going to have to pay for it at some point in time. If we can account for it now, it can help us explore how to do things cost effectively. So what we tend to do is take the estimated total economic impact for the town and divide it by our total current GHG emissions to come up with a localized cost of carbon. And this will come up in a second when we hit the GHG. So I'll just pause just to see if there's any comments or questions anybody has.
I had a quick question. When reading through a lot of the materials, and it's a little hard to get from the ones you just sent, but some of the other ones, units of things. It's a little hard for me to tell what units we're talking about. I guess greenhouse gas emissions, I think that was defined somewhere. And when you're just talking percentages, it doesn't matter very much, but maybe I'll have to come up with a concrete questions. You've gone through all the slides, so I can't see, but I'll think of it. I'll come up with one as we go along.
Okay, thank you. And I will definitely clarify anything to make sure. Okay, so the next thing we'll hit, and I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here, the greenhouse gas inventory. So this is an accounting of both community-wide as well as municipal operations impacts. We did 3 years, 2013, 2016, and 2019. We did that so we could try to help create some sort of a sense of movement. So we see if there's any trends that are currently in place. And there are some positive trends in place. Community-wide, we're seeing over that time frame almost 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We've over the same time also seen roughly a 2.5% decrease in population. We've also seen during that same time a 15% increase in GDP economy and an increase of about 4 to 5% in employment. To give you a sense of our total emissions, which by the way I didn't say, by 2019 our total community-wide emissions are 93,735. That's community-wide. That 93,000 and some change carbon footprint turns into a mass of greenhouse gas that's roughly 1.85 billion cubic feet of man-made greenhouse gas, or a volume of roughly about 1/4 mile in all directions. And this is just shown kind of sitting on top of Wilder, just to kind of give you a sense of what that is. Those emissions, by the way, will stay in the atmosphere at least a century, if not longer, impacting our climate. And again, just sort of highlighting that what the past chart shows. So the community has already seen a decrease in emissions and an increase in GDP, which helps to illustrate that the linkage between climate action and negative economic effects is not very real. We do this for every community. I've not seen one yet where that chart doesn't look at least like that. So we can act on climate, and that doesn't mean a disaster for our economy. We've also broken down then the emissions by sector and tried to give you a sense of kind of what the ups and downs are. In general, our energy sector has decreased quite significantly. However, our energy consumption has gone up. So we're using more electricity, but the carbon emissions associated with each kilowatt hour is going down, thankfully. Transportation has done a little dip. It's up just a tidge over that study time frame, about 1%. Our solid waste, we've seen a drop about 5%, which is fantastic. And it relates to our solid waste handling, which has gone down in the amount of landfill tons. Our recycling has gone in the opposite direction, at least the data that we have. And Eric was just able to secure additional data, so that may change here. We'll be tweaking that with new info. And then water and wastewater emissions have decreased quite significantly. That comes all into really the efficiency of the energy emissions associated with the processing, the municipal water plants and wastewater plants. That really has made a big difference. But you'll see that as a percentage, water and wastewater makes up just 0.5%. Solid waste is about 1.1% of our community-wide emissions. Transportation is 50%, and energy is about 50%. And transportation will be climbing as our energy continues to get cleaner and cleaner. So kind of the takeaway here is transportation is going to be an important focal point. Our community-wide, or excuse me, our municipal operations, they break down in similar categories. We name them a little bit differently, but it's the same categories. Our total municipal operations, and this is scope 1 and 2, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is 1,700 metric tons. And just a little graphic to show, when we talk about municipal operations, it's the hole inside the donut. So when we talk about community-wide, it already covers municipal operations, so these are not additive. It just helps us zero in on specific municipal operations emissions, which total about 1.8% of the total community-wide emissions. We also have this little community comparison. You guys look awesome compared against almost everybody else. You benefit quite awesomely from the good grid maneuvers that are happening. When we look at regionally here, we've got a few folks that are beating us: Burlington, Essex Junction, Portland, Somerville, Boston. They're all ahead of us a bit, so we can catch up to them and pass them. And this just kind of gives you a sense from a chart perspective. These are on per capita emissions. It's the way we compare communities. We've done a business as usual forecast to get a sense of where things might be going from trends perspectives. And you can see we've got an awesome trend, which is our building emissions, our electric emissions are dropping, and they're going to eventually go to zero based on commitments from Green Mountain Power. So if they meet their commitments, that yellow stuff, which is our electricity emissions, are going to zero out, which is beautiful. This dashed line is the community's stated goal of net zero by 30. And you can see this is what remains to be dealt with. And the more significant sectors are really, it really comes down to transportation and heating fuel, burning of heating oil or propane, natural gas, etc. So taking those numbers, we had the economic impact for Hartford. We've now got our townwide emissions, which gives us an estimated localized cost of carbon of about $105 per metric ton. Okay, any questions on the inventory?
Yeah, I have a quick question. This is Kyle McClure. You mentioned in a few places that the per kilowatt hour emissions have decreased. Can you elaborate on what changes happened on the grid to account for that?
Absolutely. I can what's happening when we see emissions, so when we do inventories, it comprises, there's two data sets that you mesh together. One data set is raw consumption. So how many miles are we driving in our car? How many electrons are we eating in our electrical appliances? And how many therms or gallons of fuel are we burning for heat or cooking, etc. And so the raw data is one set. The other data set then is the emission factors. Now, some of the emission factors don't change. A therm of natural gas is a therm of natural gas by and large. However, when it comes to electricity, the emissions factor for electricity is based on what sources are contributing the electricity to the grid where we are at. In the instance, in your instance, Green Mountain Power has come in and they have clearly made it a commitment to advance renewable energy in their portfolio. And they have been succeeding at that. They've been clipping along pretty well at replacing their sources that they are generating and purchasing electricity from in order to provide your community. And as they do that, they're replacing, in your instance, it'll be replacing, probably natural gas electric plants with renewable, with solar or wind or hydro, for instance. And so as they do that, as they continue to convert their portfolio over, we will continue to see their emissions factor per kilowatt hour drop, as long as they keep with their commitment.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so then the third background is the Renewable Energy Potential Study, and I'm just going to really touch on this. We've got some background information about Vermont and solar in Vermont. We've got data about the state the town of Hartford and the town's share. The spoiler is that we're above average in terms of the estimated generating capacity when compared to the statewide. We're also above average in terms of solar companies based on population share. So we're positioned better than average in Vermont, which is great. We're behind average though in terms of the number of installations per 1,000 households, which probably comes down to we probably have some larger installations. I know that for a fact because our generating capacity is up, but our number of installations is down on average. So it just means that we're probably putting in bigger arrays, which is not a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of. We then went through a process to identify the rooftop potential of solar. The total rooftop potential can provide roughly 30% of townwide electric consumption. We then adjust that number based on the likely cost-effective potential. So in other words, if we have an array that's facing north, that may not give us the same kind of return on investment as a south-facing array might, for instance. So we've tweaked that to arrays which, from the satellite view, we think would be reasonably cost-effective, and that gets us to about 22% of townwide consumption. So that means if we used all of our cost-effective roofs in the community, we probably hit about 20 to 22%. We then want to figure out what's the likely absorption. What are the scenarios for that? Because just because I have a roof that can use solar doesn't mean I'm going to go out and put solar on my roof. And we have a couple different cases just based on our relationship with the state statistics. And there are some good projected increases statewide. So we have a sense as to how much more solar is going to go into the state in the next 5 years or so. So just kind of mapping against those, we come up with a couple different, 3 different projections, which I was supposed to have all 3 of them, but they've disappeared. So we've got 3 different scenarios. And what you'll find for each scenario, we kind of map out in 5-year chunks. So about 2025, 2030, and then also out to 2040. And we give the total annual generation potential, the total cumulative installed kilowatt capacity, and then the percent of citywide electricity consumption that those scenarios could generate. We also translate those numbers into, all right, well, if you were to do that, how many houses would you have to convert every year in order to reach that? Or how many commercial size arrays would you have to get in place every year to achieve that? So for each scenario, we map that out. And so all of this background information gets stuffed into the carbon neutral pathways and strategic goal document. So all that background stuff, you don't ever have to look at it, but I want you to be aware of what's in it so that as you guys are talking, if you're looking for a resource, it very likely already exists, so it's a good place to start. But we've then taken all of that data and we've gone through it and identified what we think are certainly appropriate overall pathways, and then some suggested recommendations as a starting place. And so the pathways to reduction, to reducing the overall emissions are reducing. So that's energy efficiency, driving less, generating less waste, using less water, etc. It includes fuel switching, which are things like, let's get more renewables going. Let's focus on thermal energy, fuel switching from things that fossil fuels to others. Focus on fuel switching for transportation, electrification, and others. The potential for sequestration, we likely will have some green space strategies, and there might be some sequestration potential in there for us. And then, of course, as a strategy, offsetting. In the introduction here, we kind of summarize each of the sectors which have those pathways involved, which are buildings and energy, transportation and land use, waste management, water and wastewater, and then for sequestration, trees and green space. For each one, we've summarized what the draft strategic goal recommendations will account for. So we've provided in each section a draft recommendation of strategies, and we've modeled those preliminarily. Now, those models may, they may tweak a bit, but they're going to get us in a good sort of ballpark to get us a sense as to if we were to accomplish the things that we've mapped out, what can we expect in terms of our emissions reductions? And for municipal operations, through reducing fuel switching, we can make up the bulk of it. There is some offsetting that would be needed in order for us to achieve 100% potentially. And I say that because some of our assumption is that when we get into our transportation category, our vehicles, we got dump trucks, we've got other vehicles that we may discover might be challenging to convert to electric or another option. So we've made a preliminary assumption as to a percentage, about 25%, that we're just going to say may be tough to transmit here in the next few years. Once we get more information on the breakup of the fleet, we may be able to refine that number. So, but the other categories, we think we can pretty much make up for those impacts. The other range is in our water and wastewater, particularly associated with the abiotic emissions, which are, we have processes that are emitting methane from the process plant. Those things, that emission we're not accounting for here, although there may be strategies for us to turn that into a fuel. If we do turn it into a fuel, we still have an emission. It's now in the fast carbon cycle. I'm getting into too much detail on that. But the upshot is that without offsetting scope 1 and 2 emissions, we can get to about 35% reduction. With offsetting is 100%. If we look at scope 3, if we include in scope 3, which would be our purchases associated with, for instance, paper and materials and so forth, without offsetting, we're at about 28%. And we could still offset to 100%. For community-wide, and you know what, I just realized this number, I'm sorry, this number is incorrect. This is not 35%, it's actually like 80, I'm sorry, it's 85%. I'll correct this. I'm sorry that that's wrong. This is higher. For scope 1 and 2, for municipal, it's closer to like an 80% range. I'm very sorry about that. Community-wide, it's 35%. That one I know is correct. So we're offsetting, we're reducing about 35% of our emissions potentially through the pathways that we've mapped out. And of course, we could offset to 100%. And if we include scope 3, which would again be, I buy a toaster, I buy food, I buy an airplane to Puerto Rico or whatever, that's scope 3 on a community scale. If we were to include that, then we'd be achieving about a 14% total reduction. Now, for each of those sections, what you'll find then is there's background on that section, a little bit of information about the section itself, some data related to Hartford, and then the initial sector goals for each sector for community-wide as well as municipal. Now, I know that and hopefully everybody's had a chance to look at those because we'll be transitioning into our small group in a second. But what I want to point out is that I know that the recommendations that we've mapped out do not achieve the 100% emissions reduction by 2030. That is not to say that you cannot do it. What we've put into the document is our initial sense as to, we usually, at the beginning, we tend to try to aim at an area that we think is achievable and also stretchy, but not overwhelming. It does not mean that it's the only path, nor the only answer. So as you explore these, you may decide, you know what, forget transitioning to 30% EVs by 2030. We want 100% of everybody's cars on the road to be EV by 2030. And that is clearly a part of what this team can do, is decide what is right for the community. But our initial recommendations in here are trying to sort of hit that spot where we feel it's important for us to start off with something that we think is achievable and also stretchy, but then use that as a starting point for the conversation. So, are there any questions at all about these background documents that anybody wants to throw out there?
I'd like to ask a question. This is Carolyn Hooper. I have a couple of quick ones. There is a pretty significant assumption that Green Mountain Power will be meeting their goals in order for us to meet our goals. So if they don't, then basically we're vulnerable because we're relying on a third party to meet their goals for us to meet our goals. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, that would be correct.
Okay, and so they're showing good progress. How vulnerable are we to them not meeting their goals?
That is a superb question. And I don't know that I know the answer to that from the perspective of how committed are they really. I would say that you can kind of think about it in terms of risk categories. So the first is how committed are they? And then the second is what do they have control over and what do they not have control over associated with meeting those goals? And the third is, do they have a plan to achieve their goal? From the outside, from what I can glean at this point, they do have a plan to achieve their goals, and they do seem to be committed. It's where the full range of their risk might be in terms of hitting that. And the other thing that I think it's a very important conversation and topic, because you'll see in our recommendations, we do talk about renewables. We haven't hit it hard yet. And part of that is we were just sort of evaluating, if we look at the emission sectors, there is risk that if Green Mountain Power doesn't pull through, that we're missing our electricity emissions. But the upside is we do have a willing and focused partner there that has a commitment. So that's fantastic, right? A lot of communities don't have that. So that's a positive, that's a check in that box. But then when we look at, for instance, in transportation, transportation is a challenging sector because you and I, we all buy our own car or we do whatever we're doing with our transportation choices. And that's a heavy emission sector that right now doesn't have sort of an orchestrated change process behind it that's evolving it, right? So, and the same thing with heating fuel. So as you look at all the categories, you may get to a point where you say as a community, well, we have so much effort that we can put into something, so much resources or what have you, how will we prioritize where we put those? And so that's part of the conversation as well, right? They're part of the thought process.
Okay, and another quick one is, nothing exists in a box, including the town of Hartford. So how much are we affected by surrounding communities in terms of things that pass through our airspace, that pass through our water, so we are not a discrete, isolated entity.
Absolutely, and that's a fantastic point wherein very strongly the community is looking at adaptation as well as mitigation, and so those future climate impacts. I have every confidence the town of Hartford is going to hit its goals, right? And there might be trip ups along the way, but we're going to get there because this is a committed community. But when you do, it'll still be a tiny impact in the massive bucket that is humanity. And so you're right that we will, being mindful of how those other decisions and successes impact us or not. From a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, the good thing is that the counting is within the boundary by and large. We have some that's our waste going out of boundary, and then of course the Green Mountain Power, which you've already identified as it's a risk.
And finally, and I'm going to throw this out, I don't understand a whole lot about offsetting. And so at some point, I would like to have more information about that because, limited information, but it's a big part of the goal here. And so I'd really like to understand more about that. And so it doesn't have to be now, but I just throw that out there as a need.
You bet. Awesome. Okay. Colleen, do you want to maybe start talking a little bit about how the breakouts will function? And I'm going to go into breakout room organization mode.
Yes, real quickly before you do that, I just see that Laura has her hand up. And so I was wondering if she had a question.
Thank you, Colleen and Ted. And I want you to know I am committed to everything you're doing, but I'm going to bring up a couple points. Green Mountain Power came up, and I want us to realize that they are owned by a Canadian company. I don't know if they've changed this in the last couple of years, but they consider gas to be, fracked gas included, to be renewable. They also, and so are we in our efforts, considering hydropower to be renewable. Hydropower is an issue in terms of its impact on the Indigenous Canadian folks. And I also have concern about biomass. With that, those three things said, I still am committed, and I know we all are committed. I think we may have to have some caveats along the way. And I will do my best to find the research material to back up these three areas that I'm concerned about, besides what Carolyn just said about the offsets. I don't know as much about that either, but I don't see them as a magical cure. And there are many people in the field of climate who are concerned about these things. Thanks.
Those are all superb points, and it does point to the kind of conversations that we can have as sub-teams too, like how do we want to define what we see as appropriate for our community? I think that's perfect.
Okay, well, I can go ahead while we're kind of moving into the next part of our agenda. Ted's going to take a few minutes to put everybody into breakout rooms. And while he's doing that, I'm just going to quickly go through the next steps that we are working on tonight. So in the chat, you should be getting a link and also some information. You would have also gotten an email earlier today with this information as well, but wanted to make sure that everybody had access to the documents we're going to be using. Basically, there's a link at the bottom of the message that I just put in the chat that will take you to some Google Docs, and as well as a copy of the full carbon neutral pathways document that Ted was just speaking about. So our plan for our next bit of time is to get into our breakout rooms, and we're going to do 3 different rounds that each of the sub-teams can meet. So please let me know as you're clicking on that link if anybody is not able to access that, and I can send you the link directly. We definitely problem solve around that, so we make sure everybody has access. In the document, again, is the full report, and then underneath it gives us the sense of kind of the scheduling for our breakout rooms. There'll be 20 minutes each with 5 minutes in between. And the idea being really just to, once you get into your breakout groups, so for example, in our first round of 20 minutes, the transportation and land use sub-team will be meeting, the waste management sub-team will be meeting, and the local food sub-team will be meeting. And once you click on the link that fits with your sub-team, you will see a Google Doc that has more information in there. So for example, I just happen to be in the transportation and land use, but the beginning information will be the same for everybody. So you will see, again, another link to the full report, and then just an outline of what to consider when you're taking a first glance at the pathways and those strategic goals that you may be getting a first look at. You may have already taken a look at these as well, but now you're getting a chance to discuss them together. So the goals are pretty simple. Or really, first, if you would like, if possible, to pick a sub-team coordinator, and that person is not responsible for coming up with all the ideas or even do all the recording. It is a Google Doc, so you can work in there at the same time, but more to facilitate, to stay on topic if need be, And then just to make sure everybody is heard from. So it is a team. We want to make sure that everybody's voices are heard. Everybody's voices are key to this process. So that would be the first piece. And then that person also could have the job of reporting back. Now, that 5-minute in between times of our the 20-minute pieces of a breakout and then 5-minute in between could be a time to report out. And it would be very quick. It would be maybe a minute. It would just be an opportunity to say, was there a group consensus? You know, what kind of was the feeling of the discussion during that time? It's also a great time for a bio break in between our group breakout sessions. The discussion during those 20 minutes would really focus mainly on, or at least as a guide, to think about, as you're looking at those strategic goals, those potential goals, moving forward, what do you think? How well do you think they fit the needs of Hartford? Are there any goals that you think should be eliminated? Any goals you think should be added? And then any changes that you see to the recommended goals. So it's really just, it's a next step, kind of a first deep or a dive in, and we'll get deeper dives in future meetings. So, does anybody have any questions right now? Again, you'll be put into the breakout rooms. You don't have to worry about where you're going. Once Ted hits the magic button, off you go. I just want to make sure everybody has access to those documents and see if anybody has any questions, kind of what the intent of our next piece of time is.
And while you guys are considering that question, there are a couple folks I'm not sure where to assign. My list doesn't have them on. So if you wouldn't mind, Anna, Cynthia, and Carl, I'm not sure which group you guys are looking at here for the first group.
Food, please. It's Cynthia.
Cynthia, okay, thank you.
This is Carl. Transportation for the first.
Okay, Carl in transportation. Okay.
I'll go to waste management, and I did see Eric has his hand up.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. And Eric, did you have your hand up?
Yes, thanks. I had a question, just maybe just a clarification. If we are not sure about the goals, would it be a useful, would we be spending our time usefully if we just talked about how we might go about that process? Like, for example, in food, there are a list of people that I'm thinking I'd like to reach out to and run some of this information by. And I don't know if, I'm assuming this is sort of an iterative process, and we will, this won't be our last chance to refine these goals.
Absolutely, and even to the point that, so what if you may recall from our first discussion, there's strategies which give us direction, strategic goals. They're going to tell us, like, we're going to reduce this, and this is the general way that we're going to do that. And then there's detailed actions. And what we can find is that we can even begin to dig into detailed actions and still feel like these numbers here have some tweakability to it, right? So it's a process that we can continue to massage together from two different directions. And as Colleen was noting, our next workshop, we can also do some breakout time. It could be focused on continuing this conversation, or some teams might be ready for the next step. So that can have some flex to it. Okay. Any other questions? I've got one other question for the whole group. I'm sorry, I went too slow. So we are tagging about a half an hour behind schedule. I'm very sorry about that. We have an option. We can compress the breakout times, make them like 15 minutes each, or we can keep them the same time and we will be over budget on the agenda, on the time. I leave it to you guys to tell me, and I'll then set the timer on the meeting accordingly.
Maybe a show of hands for one option or the other.
Yeah,
Time's the same.
You would say keep them the same. so folks that are okay with that, and I'm sorry for going over schedule. I have a hard time seeing where we're at with that.
I have one question before we do that, Ted, please.
You bet.
Yeah, I would like to rely a little bit upon you as facilitators. You've done this process before. Do you think we can do it in a shorter amount of time, or do you think we are better off using the full 20 minutes?
I think it's nice to use the full 20 minutes because, you know, some groups might, you know, actually arrive at great consensus in 20 minutes, but some groups might be just 20, it'll be 20 minutes kind of getting a sense as to how you want to approach it. So I think I would suggest it if you're okay with it. Okay.
I would just say that it looks to me like we're going to lose a number of people at 7 o'clock. So I would vote for shortening the times and just making sure to record where we are in our conversations so that we can pick it up again.
Okay. The other thing too is we can keep them at 20. Well, yeah. So I think that's a good point. We'll do that. Maybe I'll shorten to 17 minutes, and then we'll get going. Okay. I'm sorry I went long. All right. So we're going to open all rooms. You should get whirled off. Colleen, do you want to navigate us on the report backs?
Absolutely. All right, why don't we start with water and wastewater?
Okay, so first point we had about water and wastewater is we are having trouble correlating water conservation and protection from floods with reducing energy consumption. It seems like more of a resilience topic than a energy topic. We did think that we might start exploring ways to regionalize our wastewater system and make it more efficient by including more towns in the Hartford system. We don't know enough about the system and what that would entail and what efficiencies might be achieved. We talked about needing to prepare the town for more incidents like Irene. One of the ideas we brought up was that we have natural buffers along our waterways to prevent flooding. We also thought that we could educate the public as to the hazards of flooding, perhaps with some kind of signage in town parks that are along the waterways. With respect to reducing the consumption of water, since many of the residents of Hartford are on their own wells rather than the public water system, we don't know quite how we'd go about measuring the reduction. We also are concerned about those same wells in terms of, is it clear that the well water is not being polluted from below? We just don't have any information about that. And we weren't entirely sure, other than a sewage system, what generates wastewater. So there was a lot of things we need to know to be more intelligent on this subject.
Sounds like a great discussion. Thanks, John. Green space.
Sorry. I was trying to read in the chat room here. Pay attention to what's going on here. Yeah, so we had pretty good discussion, actually. We felt that in terms of increasing tree cover and diversity, and also increasing the use of native species and pollinator restorations, that these goals aren't very ambitious, that we could do better. Yeah, especially in terms of using residential areas and utilizing residential areas and increasing the tree cover and or shrub cover as a way of making available wildlife corridors, so that we have sort of a more functioning ecosystem running throughout the town, which is also creating green space around the more densely packed residential areas. So I'll just leave it at that. We think we can especially do better regarding lawns. Personally, I think it's a waste of money to buy a lawnmower. I borrow my neighbors about 3 times a year, and we kind of put up with a few extra ticks. But we do have flowers that are growing all over the place. In terms of number 3, impervious surface reduction, we had a discussion about how impervious is gravel versus pavement, and had a discussion about pavers or structures that can be put in parking lots that would allow grass to grow up through them as an option. Let's see. I had proposed some sort of rewording for the 4th one that kind of leaned in more into caring of the forest and ecosystems to kind of bring management in there. And Carolyn brought in a point of we should not be considering only Western type culture when we do that. We should also be consulting with and relying upon indigenous peoples' practices. Yeah, and adding into this, enhancing in the process of doing that management, enhancing abilities to sequester and store carbon. So in other words, have these processes, both the agriculture and the forest, be carbon storing and utilization practices. Yeah, I think that's basically it. Anybody else? No, thank you.
John. And last but certainly not least, climate economy.
Eric, do you want me to take that one?
Please do, and I'll maybe add that last point that we were talking about as the room was closing.
Okay, so first things we talked about were, we wanted some more clarification as to the first goal, which was capture local economic potential of climate action. So what exactly is that? What are we defining as climate action? It would be helpful to have some metrics here so we can set attainable goals. We also talked about the need to not only establish, but strengthen and maintain relationships with current employers in the area in order to have a workforce that is able to meet the challenges and demands of a society that is adopting newer and cleaner technologies. We also would need to work on educating local businesses about how working towards a green infrastructure and training their staff likewise can be beneficial. When it came to marketplace climate resilience, we talked a lot about our local farmers and shortening supply chains, relying more on local foods and caring for our local farmers. We also talked about the need to work with planning and development on the town level on how we're going to fund all of these projects. We already know that the planning and development office at Hartford is very busy, and so we don't want to overload them even more and create an unsustainable system in our town in that regard. So how can we pay for all of this? And how can we also bring our most vulnerable populations with us as we work towards achieving these economic and climate goals? And then I'll leave it to Eric to talk about a metric.
Thanks. Yeah, with about 47 seconds left before the chat room closed, I introduced a topic of which we could write volumes about. But In general, I think that we should establish a goal around defining a new way to measure economic progress. So currently we rely to a large degree on GDP or some measure of growth. GDP certainly wasn't intended as a means of measuring economic, or I'm sorry, social well-being. And it really measures, it's for the most part, at least at the state level, what we measure with gross state product is receipts through the economy. So it's a measure of throughput, not necessarily of well-being. So Vermont in 2012 passed some legislation around GPI, the genuine progress indicator. And that might be something that we explore. I reached out to the state earlier today. I haven't heard back from them about what sort of data is available. But even if we have to sort of roll our own here, maybe what we need to do is come up with a better way of measuring progress, because relying on GDP just doesn't make sense. I mean, actually, it's the measure of how quickly we will drive ourselves into the ground as a humanity, that is.
Here, here. I hardly agree.
Excellent. Okay, awesome. Thank you very much for all the breakout report backs. Just one more item, that's the next steps. And I'm sorry again that I steered us a little long at the beginning. So for our next steps, and I'll send out a follow-up email, but just so you can hear it verbally, because some of us are auditory. So what we want to do next is, I'm going to share my screen here for a second so that you can see a resource on the website. Are you guys seeing the website? So on the website, under today's date, right there, there's this link here, strategy screening criteria examples. So if you click on that, it's going to open up this document. It's another Google Doc. And so if you could please just take a moment to scan through these example screening criteria. And what we will do is at our next meeting, we're going to do a democracy review on it. We're going to try to pick 3, 4, or maybe 5 of them. And we will use those in the future. Once we kind of whittled up a list of potential actions, we will use the words that we select here as part of our review to help sort of get a sense as to how well is this action going to fit our community versus that action. Of course, there'll be other reviews related to, like emissions reductions and such. So if you can take a moment to review the list. Also, if there is a word that you have, a criteria that you would love to see used, feel free to just add them in. You can just start typing them in at the bottom of the list. Okay, so that's item 1. If you can please go to this list and review it before the next meeting. The next step is just kind of starting to think a little bit. The conversations I was hearing sounds like some teams got through actually all of the items and seems like a consensus going on there. Other teams, the lists are maybe further off of what they're hoping to see, so you may not have achieved consensus on those, the recommended strategic goals. So what I would suggest is spend a little bit of time thinking about those here in the interim. At our next meeting, we'll have a longer breakout time, and you could finish the conversation from today if that's appropriate for your team. We'll also then be able to move into the next conversation, which is going to start talking a little bit about potential actions. And so to think about that, what I would suggest is if you can just start thinking in your mind, now that you have a sense of the kinds of goals that your group might want, even if they're not finalized, that's cool. At least we have a sense of that. Start thinking in your mind, what kinds of roadblocks might exist to achieving those kinds of goals in your community, just, whatever comes to mind. Or the reverse, what kinds of things could be empowering to empower the community to achieve those goals, or empower residents, or empower businesses? Just kind of think of it from a broad perspective, and just kind of let that rattle around. And the conversation next go around can be focused on those 2 things. And then we'll start transitioning then into actually, let's look at some detailed actions after that. Okay? Does that sound good to everybody? Is there any questions at all? Okay,
so this is just sort of a procedural question. There was a note to me in the chat room that is probably relevant, and I'm wondering whether you are capturing those.
I believe the way Zoom's going to work here is I think I can capture everything that was, if it was in a main chat group to everybody, but if it may have been between folks, I don't think I get that. So if it was open to everybody, I think it will be captured.
I'll probably repost one then. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Great. Any questions or comments? Okay. Thank you, everybody, so much for all of your time. I'm sorry that I got us off to 20-minute late here, but we were hearing great conversations. Thank you very much for your commitment and your conversation. Just kind of circling through the groups, it was fantastic what I was hearing. You guys were all talking about the right things. So thank you so much for all of your energy. Oh, one last thing. At the bottom of next steps, we have proposed next meeting dates. Eric, is there any way that you'd like to handle that specifically? We have the next 4 workshops, prelim dates identified. We could just have folks report in if any of those are absolute showstoppers, or hopefully everybody can put those on their schedules and we can make them work. I don't know, Eric, if you have a way that you'd like to handle that.
Yeah, we could try it now, but it might just be more practical if I send a poll out, unless people don't really want to see more polls. I just find that to be an easy way to find a date and let people check their calendars. So I'm seeing a couple thumbs up.
Use the polls.
Okay. All right. I'll send one out in the morning with options for meeting 3.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. And you'll get a follow-up email also for next steps, just so it's in writing. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night. Happy Inauguration Day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. See you.